want you to think of a goblin for a second. Just imagine it. Try to picture it in your head. Now, that goblin, what color is it? And that's a good question. That's what we're going to dive into today, is asking, why is your goblin green? Don't deny it. Okay, there's a few people. Maybe you're out there in the realm of purple goblins. Maybe you're thinking of a yellow goblin. But I can almost guarantee that you thought of a green goblin. After watching The Hobbit and getting into the start of what's going to be a dive into all things goblin, the history, and how we're at the modern goblins, the beings of mischief. And then when I was doing the introduction to Plunderlings and talking about all the different colors of goblins, I really started to ask myself, why is the default goblin green? Why is that so well known? When did that start? When I did my first video just touching on the history of goblins and folklore and what stuff, that the idea that goblins were little fairy folk and that they were one of many different fairies and that they were more on the side of mischief and mayhem and doing naughty things. But I had to think about it. They weren't green. They were hairy. They were a lot of different things. They wore different clothes, but they weren't necessarily green. So how did that come about? Well, let's find out. So we're going to look at this topic. Why are goblins green? Are they even green? Maybe they're not. Maybe we just have one of those collective ideas that's running around as far as what goblins should be. And we're going to dig into it. But we have to take a lot of different angles. This is not an easy question to answer. So bear with me today, and I hope you enjoy it as we try to figure out why are goblins green. So let's start at Tolkien. We did our movie review of The Hobbit last week, and let's talk about goblins from the Tolkien. And this is where kind of already we're off to a challenging start, because as we mentioned when we watched the movie, one of the ideas in The Hobbit, the first book that came out, is that goblin is synonymous with orc. So as we're looking at this, we can't just look at goblins exclusively. A lot of this, as we delve into modern fantasy, is going to have to treat both orcs and goblins to answer this question. And even then, we have inside of Tolkien's works, there's a preface note explaining this about the difference between orcs and goblins, and that there's even different sizes of goblins, including the hobgoblin, which is kind of something that involves into what we might think of as more the orc. But our first line that we're going to follow here is just to talk about the Tolkien goblin. And we're going to look at The Hobbit. In chapter 4 of The Hobbit, let's see what it says about goblins. Here's a couple quotes for you. Out jumped the goblins, big goblins, great ugly looking goblins, lots of goblins. Before you could say rocks and blocks. I'll stop there. Okay, so this first quote, the first time we see that goblins describing the goblins themselves and not just being a reference to goblins, it mentions them being big, great, ugly looking. So, okay, so that doesn't give us a ton, but I mean, that's true. We still have ugly goblins. Big goblins, of course, that's probably more like what we think of as the modern fantasy orc. But there we go. So they're ugly. Our next quote, it was deep, deep dark, such as only goblins that have taken to living in the heart of the mountains can see through. So, again, just the idea here that they live underground, that probably has a bearing on their appearance. Another line here, the goblins were very rough, talking about their demeanor, not their skin necessarily, and pinched unmercifully, and chuckled and laughed in their horrible, stony voices. The goblins began to sing or croak, keeping time with the flap of their flat feet on the stone, and shaking their prisoners as well. So these are more about the feeling that Bilbo or the author wants us to get about the goblins, the orcs here, being very stony, rough, croaking even. That's a deliberate word choice, and even flat feet. So all this kind of gives me little ideas of something very coarse, very unnatural, inhuman. And then even that croaking and flat feet kind of makes me think even amphibian or frog-like, which is when we talked about the Rankin Bass interpretation of the goblins. You can see that there, that they were big, croaking, flat, rough, in very stony colors. So gray is kind of what we're thinking of at this point. Next in Chapter 4, we meet the Goblin King. There, in the shadows on a large flat stone, sat a tremendous goblin with a huge head, and armed goblins were standing around him, carrying the axes and the bent swords that they use. Now, goblins are cruel, wicked, and bad-hearted. They make no beautiful things, but they make many clever ones. They can tunnel and mine as well as any but the most skilled dwarves when they take the trouble, though they are usually untidy and dirty. Hammers, axes, swords, daggers, pickaxes, tongs, and also instruments of torture. They make very well, or get other people to make their design, prisoners and slaves that have to work till they die for want of air and light. It is not unlikely that they have invented some of the machines that have since troubled the world, especially the ingenious devices for killing large numbers of people at once. For wheels and engines and explosions always delighted them, and also not working with their own hands more than they could help. But in those days and those wild parts, they had not advanced, as it is called, so far. So there we see just a little description of the Goblin King, and more the attitude. You can see that these are oddly maybe not quite as rough, since they seem to eschew or reject working with their own hands. So that's kind of an interesting, different little detail of them. But honestly, that's about all we get as far as exposition on what their appearance was like. Again, this is where Tolkien, he played off of the folk memory, and people were kind of expected to know or imagine for themselves what these things actually looked like. These are all of those ideas of these are a violent, torturing race that have slaves. But at no point do we get like a hard physical description or an exacting one. But we do see just little hints of what we might be able to project onto the goblins. But as far as the Hobbit, that's really all we get. The rest of the book, it doesn't mention anything about their appearance much more other than their untidiness or how they arrange themselves. But as far as it being physically a certain color, the Hobbit comes up empty. We don't have it there. So let's jump ahead, and we're going to talk about how the orcs are described in Lord of the Rings, the other series of books that Tolkien wrote, really again establishing much of the fantasy canon. And the terms that are used there, again, I don't have good quotes for this, just picking them out from different places. But they are almost always referred to as orcs now. And then the words that are used are sallow, which refers to an unhealthy yellowish color, black and brown. There's a word swelt as well, that, if I have that right, that refers to them just being a very dark color, dark and ruddy. So you might think of the orcs in the Lord of the Rings movies that Peter Jackson did, that was a pretty accurate interpretation. There's different colors going on, but at no point do we hear about green, especially in relation to goblins. We know that in the movies they did kind of distinguish that there were the orcs that were above ground and the Uruk-hai that were kind of further twisted and made and engineered, and they were very red. But a lot of the orcs are not necessarily green. And then the goblins, the ones that we see in the first movie that are underground, they were very pale colors, very pale skinned. But they, again, nothing really showing green. So yeah, it's interesting that at this point, just looking at kind of what is we think of as the main reference for orcs and goblins, we don't have green yet. So where does this come from? I'm going to refer to at least one painting here, but several started to come out in the 70s as Tolkien's works got to be really popular. And one that in researching this subject gets pointed out is a painting called The Road to Minas Tirith by Tim Kirk in 1975. And what's interesting about this work is that the orcs here in all their armor are green. They are green skinned. There's a lot of other colors in this scene, but we see that the orcs are green skinned. So that's a big difference from what was written. Maybe there was some other notes. I haven't been able to find anything else as far as the Tolkien angle of why orcs and goblins turned green, but this painting seems to be something, one of the earliest ones, if reasons we can look at as to why orcs and goblins are green. So we've kind of struck out on our first line. What might be your next thought? For me, I had to think, well, maybe this is one of the Dungeons and Dragons things. Maybe that's where this came from, that kind of codified or canonized green goblins. So let's run through Dungeons and Dragons to see if this is where green goblins come from. So this is from the 1977 Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Monster Manual. It has a description for goblins. Goblins range from yellow through dull orange to brick red in skin color. Their eyes are reddish to lemon yellow. They dress in dark leather gear, and their garments tend towards dull, soiled-looking colors, brown, drab, dirty gray, stained maroon. Goblins reach the age of 50 years or so. We're on the wrong end of the spectrum, yellow through red. Orcs description, since we're looking at parallel development here. Let's see what the orcs say. The orcs description reads, orcs appear particularly disgusting because their coloration, brown to brownish green with a bluish sheen, highlights their pinkish snouts and ears. Their bristly hair is dark brown or black, sometimes with tan patches. Even their armor tends to be unattractive, dirty, and often a bit rusty. Orcs favor unpleasant colors in general. Okay, well, we finally have at least a mention of green, but it says that their coloration is a brownish green with a bluish sheen. Not really the hardcore green that we see in goblins today. And they mention things like having a pink snout and ears. That's a very different look, and one that we'll see how that gets developed here. But really, yeah, this kind of says there might be some green, but more browns or brownish green. The idea is just a very ugly color, something not attractive, unhealthy even. And again, that's just for orcs, not for goblins. Well, let's see how this develops. What's interesting, apparently Dungeons & Dragons 5 years later got to be popular enough to have its own toy line, which is great for us because we like toys and we like goblins. And in there they produced a number of things that really fits what we're looking for, although it doesn't say it. So there were the official Advanced Dungeons & Dragons toys, and there were a couple packs. There was a bugbear and goblin, and then there was a terrible troll. Let me look at my picture. Yeah, terrible troll and goblin. And what's interesting is here the goblins are very tiny. They're little guys. They're dressed in just some rough wool hair clothes, but they are green skinned. So this is one of the first times we have deliberately a goblin Again, kind of flying in the face of what's in the monster manual itself that was available, and they are green skinned. So there you go. We have green skinned goblins here, kind of breaking canon, but they have green goblin figures in 1982. There's also Zarek, the evil half orc assassin with green skin. It's interesting because if he's half orc, I don't know Dungeons and Dragons, but he's half orc, but then it says he has to be half something else. From just briefly what I've read in Dungeons and Dragons, it mentions that to be a half orc, you probably are also half goblin. That it's breeding between orc and other goblinoids, goblins or hobgoblins. So he's potentially a goblin as well, but he's at least half orc and green skinned. So here in 1982, we have precedent for green goblin and orc figures. We go forward a year to 1983, and we find there were orcs in the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon. And these fit the description of the orcs from the first monster manual, with green, very green skin, but pink snouts. So they have a little bit more of a dog or porcine, like a pig look to them, but they are orcs and they have green skin. So it's interesting because we have this moment, 1982 and 1983, of a few examples of green skin with orcs and goblins. But is that it? Is this where all this comes from? Maybe not. The next edition of Dungeons and Dragons, second edition, came out, I have it in 1989, and this is how goblins are described. These small, evil humanoids would merely be pests if not for their great numbers. Goblins have flat faces, broad noses, pointed ears, wide mouths, and small, sharp fangs. Their foreheads slope back and their eyes are usually dull and glazed. They always walk upright, but their arms hang down almost to their knees. Their skin colors range from yellow through any shade of orange to a deep red. Usually a single tribe has members of all of about the same color skin. Their eyes vary from bright red to a gleaming yellow. They wear clothing of dark leather tending toward dull, soiled-looking colors. Pretty similar to what we saw in the first edition, and importantly, again, we're on the wrong end of the spectrum. This is describing yellow, orange, red, darker or off colors of that. But the green figures that we just had released some years earlier, how does that fit in? Let's also look at orcs again, just to kind of see maybe again, this confusion that's been around since the beginning between goblins and orcs is creeping in. Orcs vary widely in appearance as they frequently crossbreed with other species. In general, they resemble primitive humans with gray-green skin covered with coarse hair. Orcs have a slightly stooped posture, a low jutting forehead, and a snout instead of a nose, though comparisons between this facial feature and those of pigs are exaggerated and perhaps unfair. Orcs have well-developed canine teeth for eating meat and short pointed ears that resemble those of a wolf. Orcish snouts and ears have a slightly pink tinge. Their eyes are human with a reddish tint that sometimes makes them appear to glow red when they reflect dim light sources in near darkness. This is actually part of their optical system, a pigment which gives them infravision. Now this is interesting. The last time it was kind of brown or with a little green and a bluish hue. Now this is very much saying gray-green skin. Really, again, kind of pushing it or codifying it with the idea of green skin. Well, let's see where this develops. The third edition Monster Manual of Dungeons and Dragons from 2001 says that a goblin stands 3 to 3.5 feet tall and weigh 40 to 45 pounds. Its eyes are usually dull and glazed, varying in color from red to yellow. A goblin's skin color ranges from yellow through any shade of orange to a deep red. Again, it mentions about their tribe and their color. It's almost just a repeat with the little addition of their height and weight. Not much new here. Again, it seems like Dungeons and Dragons is sticking to that end of the spectrum for goblins. Interestingly, the orcs, now in 2001, this creature looks like a primitive human with gray skin and coarse hair. So now they're just gray. So this is kind of interesting that the goblins are really sticking to what they're supposed to be. And then the orcs are just kind of, I don't know, they're just gray now? That's a pretty big change. We got to keep going with this. The 4th edition Monster Manual in 2008 says a member of the goblin species has skin of yellow, orange, or red. Again, often shading to brown. Its eyes have the same color variance. Its hair is always dark. Big pointed ears stick out from the sides of their head, and prominent sharp teeth sometimes jut from the mouth. Males have coarse body hair and might grow facial hair. And I have to mention this because the pictures, okay, this is the text description. I don't know how this could be confused, but the picture here in the 4th edition Monster Manual, they are clearly green. Again, I don't know what kind of color spectrum that they are thinking about, where yellow, orange, red, and then it goes green. Like, green is not in that part of the spectrum. But the picture here, by this time, there was a feeling, even though they don't want to write it, goblins had green skin. They have this picture here. This is how they're illustrating in this monster manual. There's 3 goblins, and they all have the same green color. So as the text is telling us, hey, there's these different colors, there's some range, they're bright. No, they're green. This is, I've never played Dungeons and Dragons, and just on doing this, I could get a feeling for why not. This inconsistency is just, this is getting to me. Right now, I think, I have no idea really, the 5th edition Monster Manual, it has a great picture of this handsome yellow-orange goblin, and honestly, it doesn't have, that I saw in the version that I could get a hold of, it doesn't explain what goblins even look like. It just kind of talks about their tribalism and their character, but it doesn't mention their color at all. But then in the entry on hobgoblins, that's coming up again. Hobgoblins have dark orange or red-orange skin and hair ranging from dark brown to dark gray. Yellow or dark brown eyes peer out beneath their beetling brows, and their wide mouths sport sharp and yellowed teeth. A male hobgoblin might have a large blue or red nose, which symbolizes virility and power among goblinkin. Goblinkind, maybe, I don't know. So the hobgoblins here are described in a little more detail, but again, the picture and the lack of description kind of gives you an idea that they kind of have given up on trying to explain what a goblin looks like, which is in a way what Tolkien kind of did. Just kind of said, you know what a goblin looks like, or you know what, if you want to make different goblins, do it. You know, but they don't. Dungeons and Dragons really, as much as they've tried to codify the goblin skin color, the same time they also just backed away from it completely in this edition. It's a weird thing. I have to say, Dungeons and Dragons has not impressed me with their descriptions of goblin coloration. And this is certainly, other than we have the toys and the cartoon and one picture, really pushing for what color the goblin should be. So those are interesting because those are kind of outliers, but the formal canon seems to be against green goblins in Dungeons and Dragons. I was not expecting that. So Dungeons and Dragons was a bust. Where do we go next? Our next line we're going to look at is Warhammer. Warhammer Fantasy, one of, again, these institutions of fantasy gaming. Let's follow this all the way down. Okay, so Goblins in Warhammer First Edition 1983. Okay, so when we saw those green goblin toys and the cartoon, Warhammer in their first edition, when it was kind of more a combination of a system that you could do role playing, or you could do the battles, like the tabletop war gaming like they're known for. Now, the first edition of Warhammer is really a system to do all of that. And it's pretty cool, but boy, is it kind of a tough read these days. But anyway, we can find it does mention goblins. Goblins were one of the main races, since they kind of even acknowledge this is to build off of the Tolkien mythos or the Tolkien fantasy realm. So our entry on goblins in Warhammer First Edition: all goblins are evil, black-hearted, and mean creatures who delight in needless slaughter and torture. So they've got the character right. They live for the most part amongst underground caverns and caves. Sunlight pains them so much that it is avoided unless dire necessity drives them from their holes. Okay, that's it. Goblins hate dwarves. Goblins fear elvish units if they're too big. The types of goblins, they mention a night goblin, a red goblin, goblins in general, a greater goblin, a lesser goblin, and lesser night goblins. So there's a whole range here of different toughnesses and movements and different things. And it mentions that red goblins show a preference for riding giant wolves, goblins, and great goblins for boars. These are different types. These different type of goblins are apt to feud amongst themselves. And so there's and the night goblins have night vision. So they don't quite get into a lot of detail on that. And again, this kind of makes sense since Warhammer, Citadel, Games Workshop, all of that was to move some miniatures, and so they want you to paint. And so they don't necessarily want to completely dictate this is what this needs to look like, because then that limits you. And then it limits your paints you're going to buy, the figures you're going to buy to paint up, all that good stuff. So at least from the outset, we don't have a hard description that I could find in the first edition of Warhammer what goblins are supposed to look like. Next, we're going to look at what they called, was part of Warhammer's second edition, called a set called Ravening Hordes. This is where they kind of made it more for the army building aspect and different things. And on the cover, you see what might be orcs or goblins with very dark brown skin, almost black skin. So that kind of is the orc and goblin type thing. In the entries that we have here, there's a section for orcs and goblins, and there's some fun art in this book. But it does say that an army based around goblins or orcs is likely to be an amalgam of several different goblinoid races, ranging from snotlings right the way through the larger, more fearsome orcs. Is the larger orcs who are more likely to be leading the army in most of its regiments. The term goblinoid has been coined to refer to snotlings, goblins, orcs, half-orcs, and hobgoblins, although hobgoblins are unlikely to band together with other goblinoids. Then this does it again. Doesn't necessarily give much information textually or canonically of what the goblinoid should be. But again, we see on the cover, it says that they're all kind of in the same racial sphere, but then it's a little different in that the ones on the cover are very dark brown, very black-skinned. And it's interesting, there is an entry for what we call now the Goblin Fanatic, called Ball and Chain. And the only mention in here that's interesting is pretty fun. Insensitized and thoroughly blitzed on a strange herbal preparation, these revered fanatics hide themselves amongst the ranks of ordinary goblin units. Gibbering squeaky little incantations through foaming lips, they are herded into battle by those around them, their green glowing eyes staring mad and unseeing. So this is kind of the first time we have a text connecting the two. But what's interesting is, again, in this Ravening Hordes 1987, although there's no description of the goblinoids, the orcs or goblins, being green, the pictures that are in here have pretty much all the orcs and goblins with green skin. There's one or two, a couple that have like that orange-brown skin, but they have their miniatures painted in that great old Hammer way, and they're green. I mean, they have green skin. So we stay within the realm of fantasy in 1986's Blood Bowl. It's kind of an expansion to the rules that was put out in the first edition of Warhammer to just kind of go into movement and different things, but then added just a couple more rules about throwing and tackling, kind of giving a way that you can play a sport from a lot of the base rules that were already in use. And what's interesting, again, in Blood Bowl, we don't have a text description of orcs. They're described kind of as they normally are, as just big, nasty humans. But what's interesting to me is that the little paper cutout figures that you could use, if you didn't have actual models, you had the game itself came with kind of like little cardboard standees. In this, the orcs and goblins are both strictly green skinned. So it's kind of a different little addition here that to interject that here in 1986, again, we have this idea that already, even though it's not stated, the understanding is goblins and orcs are green skinned. So we kind of have that feeling, but again, we just don't have it strictly written out yet. So we're going to stay in the realm of miniatures, but we're actually going to jump over to the first edition of Warhammer 40k. Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader, released in 1987. Some of the art on this shows that our space orcs are green. And even at the outset, the introduction to this book says that pretty plainly Warhammer 40k is literally, at this point, fantasy in space, in the future. Like, it doesn't try to say, like, hey, this is, a whole new IP. This is saying this is fantasy in space. And so to do that, what they've done is they've taken some new spins, some different ways to make things more their own. And some of these ideas wind up kind of reflexing back onto Warhammer fantasy. So instead of goblins, we're looking at Gretchens. Gretchens are a smaller breed of orc, but are otherwise very similar. They share the same general skin tones, physical characteristics, and psychological traits as their larger cousins. It is likely that the two races evolved on a common world from the same distant ancestor, and they can interbreed to produce intermediate types. Gretchen vary in height from 1 to 2 meters, but most are around 1.7 meters. They're thin and wiry, agile, and quite athletic, but not particularly strong or resilient. They are also cruel and sadistic, perhaps even more so than their larger relatives. They have no respect for life and enjoy torturing, maiming, slaying, and eating their captives. Although cannibalistic, they will eat any meat, but relish the taste of human flesh above all others. Okay, so we see that basically Gretchen are little space orcs. We have that connection. They've even mentioned intermediate types. They have the same general skin tones. It's really clear what's going on here, that they're just saying these are space goblins. Orcs are large humanoids, according to Rogue Trader, averaging 2 meters tall, with long, powerful limbs. Their heads are bald and brutish, with strong thrusting jaws and beetling brows. We've heard that term beetling before. Their noses are puggish and flat, and their ears large and pointed, except where they have been bitten off during some brawl or other. Orcs are basically carnivores with huge pointed teeth, often forming vicious tusks of considerable size and ferocious appearance. Their skin is greenish, ranging from a sickeningly livid green to a drab olive color. Okay, this is kind of, I think so far, the first time we've seen just a flat out saying orcs and goblins are green. And another entry in the same Rogue Trader, it does mention an orc's skin is usually greenish, although the actual shade varies from almost black to a sickening bright yellowish color. Apart from being very warty and greasy, orc skin is extremely rough, somewhat like sandpaper. Sandpaper with stubble. So it's interesting that here we have, again, very much pushing from Warhammer 40k, just a very clear orcs, and by extension Gretchen or goblins, are green. Just flat out. I think this is the first time we've seen it that clear. A next point, and this might be one of the key moments here. In 1988, Citadel Miniatures released the Creature Paint set. And this is important because this introduced that color. I guess it was recently retired. I don't keep up on it, but that's what I understand. Goblin green. That definitive green color that was used for goblin skin, for bases. So it gives it, looks kind of like that little grassiness. The early editions of these Warhammer said, get a piece of like green felt or a green blanket to put it over a tabletop, and that's your field of battle. And so this was kind of a nice greenish color. And around this same time, there's actually a release, one I found called the Goblin Battle Chariots, and under Machineries of Destruction. The cover art on this shows that, again, all the goblins on here are green. They have different colored armor and different things. There's wolf chariots, which are cool and insane by themselves, but here we see this model kit that has the miniatures and the paint on the cover are all green. So somewhere between in the 80s, we have a definite idea starting, at least amongst miniature painters. Maybe this is something that was more not in the rules or the official canon, but something that was done in other places like, Dragon Magazine or White Dwarf, where it was that goblins especially, but orcs and goblins started to become known as green skin. So it doesn't seem like it's part of a canon thing at this point, but it was definitely understood and accepted that goblins were green at some point in the 80s. I'm not finding something that says definitively that, but that's what things start to point to with this. We're going back to the realm of Warhammer for the third edition of Warhammer Armies in 1991. This was a different... So we've been through the 80s, and then we're here in the 1991, and we have this first look that on the cover of this Warhammer Armies, there are orcs, and they are green-skinned. Inside, there's a great piece of art as well that says orcs and goblins, and it shows a lot of different ones in the style of the time. It shows a savage orc, snotlings, everybody's there. There's one black orc with the darker skin, but then everybody else is green skin. So, this is kind of unquestionably, they want to put forth goblins and orcs are green skinned. Inside the section for the sample orcs and goblins army, the miniatures are all painted up to have green skin. I think there's maybe one or two that might not be, but pretty much everybody's there. But in the text itself, there's nothing saying orcs have green skin, goblins have green skin. So here in 1991, again, it's not explicitly stated, but it's understood that goblins are green. And so we're going to come to this kind of, so far, what's the biggest point we have is Warhammer 4th edition in 1993 released the Army book exclusively for orcs and goblins. And this is where we really see, yes, they're green. It's being explicitly stated. In fact, on the back cover, it says, "Wah! The greenskins are coming." So good, right there. It calls them collectively greenskins. That's been a phrase I've been looking for. Inside, it does mention even the orc tribes. All orcs and goblins live in tribes. A tribe usually contains orcs or goblins of the same type. For example, it might be a night goblin tribe or a black orc tribe, a forest goblin tribe, etc. However, most orc tribes also include inferior goblins of lower status. Tribes vary in size from a few hundred individuals to many thousands of warriors. A tribe is led by a chieftain called a war boss, or if he's very powerful, a warlord. If a chieftain is very successful, the orc and goblins will flock to join the tribe, and other tribes will place themselves under his command. Green-skinned warriors will often travel halfway across the old world just to fight alongside a particularly powerful warlord. The tribe of a successful warlord will tend to grow in size and power, enabling it to fight other tribes or invade the realms of men. So there we go. So on the back cover, and then this part in the book saying specifically green-skinned, that's something we've really been waiting for. And so here we are. It's 1993 that we can find in kind of like the main canonical publications. It's probably understood. There's probably issues of White Dwarf or other publications that went into it, but it does seem like right now in 93 we have this definitive orcs and goblins are green. In this book too, of course, we see lots of painting guides, which is interesting because of course they just know you need green. Like it's just understood. One of the orc and goblin painting guide even mentions that, for example, orcs and goblins skins are green. So the skin areas are given a base coat of goblin green. So I mean, it was just understood. Whatever the phenomena is that goblins and orcs are green. And we saw a few years earlier the goblin green paint would have come out, but now it was really codified. Just to sort of see this through, the Warhammer Fantasy Role Play, the first edition of that, kind of a contrast to the Dungeons and Dragons, we do see goblins, an orc and a goblin on the cover. They're green-skinned. Inside it mentions goblins are the physique of goblins, that they are short, mostly being around 4 feet in height. Occasionally, an especially large goblin might reach 6 feet. Their bodies are bent, twisted, and unwashed, and their faces are distorted and leering. Their skin color varies a great deal. Oh, that's interesting. Some are pale and greenish, others are almost black. So there we go, that they are small and green. Let's see what else we have. Again, following the parallel development here in the fantasy book, it mentions that orcs are the largest of the goblinoid races, and they can reach almost 7 feet high. And then they mention that skin is often greenish or a dark olive brown and is covered in warts, scars, and filth. So here, the role-playing book is really clear on it. It's saying that, okay, this is in the Warhammer world. We have the army book and the fantasy, the role-play book. Everything's coming together to say that goblins, orcs are green. We kind of have a definitive point from there on out that, yes, it's hard not to call them green, really. So, but that's a good point of reference. I also just want to mention an article that I remember from White Dwarf magazine. I had to look up. It was from April of 2002. The Warhammer Chronicles Goblin Ecology is interesting because they went into different types, kind of the way that customizer or army people they'd make customize their own army and taking on some different things. And there's even a heading here, new greenskins. Unless otherwise noted, all the greenskins found here count as goblins for purposes of the game. So it's interesting that they kind of wanted to add some other things in, saying that being a greenskin is now no longer literal, that any of that goblinoid family. So there's fire kobolds in this world, that they're like goblins, but they have some patches of red skin, some fire on them. They have troglogob, which are kind of aquatic goblins, and that they're blue-green or turquoise in color. And then there's some hill goblins, which are kind of like Scottish goblins. And then they even have dust goblins, which are kind of undead. So they were a mix of kind of the undead or skeleton kits and then the goblin kits. And they were even more pale and white, and then they had exposed bones and things. So that was just kind of an interesting take, following this line of the Warhammer, that they went to finally saying, okay, yes, everything's green. And then I remember that article just kind of going like, hey, that's cool. Even though they're goblins, they don't need to necessarily be green. So it kind of has come round full circle in that sense, that yeah, goblins are green, and then they can also not be green, but inside they're still green. So we're pretty deep into this. We have a few more points to touch on that are worth considering. For example, it was in 1993 that Magic the Gathering, the Alpha set, came out. And in that, we see a few goblins. The Goblin King, Mons' Goblin Raiders, for example. They are shown to be green-skinned. Again, we don't have a formal declaration that they need to be green, but we see that idea of green goblins was there in 1993 in Magic, and of course that was a fixture ever since. When it comes to name recognition, Warcraft is probably one of the biggest names that somebody is going to know orcs and goblins from. It's interesting that Warcraft, Orcs and Humans first came out in 1994, just after Magic the Gathering. And in that, the orcs are green. Just straight out, they are green, and there are no goblins. And then, of course, in Warcraft 2, Tides of Darkness came out in 1995, and that expanded to include goblins and a lot of other orcs and different things. Both of these, it's kind of tricky because the understanding that I have, and I could be wrong, but that Warcraft essentially started as a way to have a computer or game, electronic game version of Warhammer. So a lot of those ideas were at the outset, that they took basically Warhammer's ideas and made it into the strategy game, and then the licensing or whatever didn't work out, and so it wound up being its own IP, it wound up being its own property. And so from that, of course, it just kept going, and they seem to have, for the most part, continued to use the idea of green orcs and goblins. They have a different in lore reason as to why orcs are green, that they have read that there's something to do with originally they had been kind of more brown colors, kind of like Tolkien, but then due to a corruption in the race that they turned green from a magical effect or something. So you kind of see where they kind of walked both of these ideas, but they've ultimately settled on now that orcs seem to be green going forward, and that went through Warcraft 3 and into World of Warcraft. So that whole franchise now is one of those kind of the icons of green goblins and green orcs, but really it's one of the later developments. Even before World of Warcraft came about, there was EverQuest, which I played, And the goblins in that were mostly green, although they did have some variation. I remember being in the north in the snow, and that the goblins were more of an icy blue. And then I kind of remember I had to look it up that there were some other red goblins even. So they kind of had that idea of goblins being predominantly green, but then also having some other variations for region. So that was interesting to see that in 1999. So we have it at some point in the 80s, goblins turned green. What I think is interesting is, for example, the movie Labyrinth in 1986. The goblins there are very gray, green, brown, green. Kind of more of a flesh tone, not the brighter, more vivid green that we usually think of today. But that would have been in this era. And of course, that's the artist Froud. Based on his work, he's the one who kind of designed those. How much he would have been based more on Tolkien's original wording versus kind of what was popular in the gaming community at that time. So kind of an interesting counterpoint there. And we still don't have really a definitive answer yet, do we? We just kind of have this understanding that at some point collectively goblins started being green. None of these really feel like a satisfying answer. And one interesting thing that I've seen posited is going back even farther and in a different genre to 1964 with the first appearance of the Green Goblin, the villain in Amazing Spider-Man number 14. This does in a lot of ways fit the idea of what we think of as the modern goblin. It's got green skin and even yellow eyes, but it's also a costume. It's understood that this isn't really a person, it's someone wearing a costume being a green goblin. So it's interesting to think that that may have had an influence, but we didn't really see that come into play for another close to 20 years. So that's kind of interesting. I do think it's worth having in mind that maybe that influenced people, maybe that inspired whoever in the gaming community started to make their orcs and goblins green and follow that kind of color scheme. But it's also it feels like a little bit of a stretch. So I'm not entirely convinced that that was an influence to make it so dominant as the trend, despite what is written in lore and different things. So it's an interesting thought. It just doesn't seem like that really captured people's attention at that time. Maybe it sparked ideas later on. I'm not sure, but I think it's worth including. I've also seen it mentioned there's a series of books written in the 1930s by Enid Blyton called The Green Goblin, the Green Goblin book. What is that to me, though, is doesn't quite work for our goal here either, in that it's quite well known. There's some art, some jackets from these books that show that this is more of the fairy type of goblin with human pigmented skin. He looks like a little old white guy, but he's wearing green. So kind of by the same reason that the Green Goblin just doesn't quite get it, it feels like it's a bit more of a stretch to say that this is why our modern fantasy goblins are green. So that's what I could find. Why are goblins green? The best answer I can give you is that it was just a kind of movement, an unspoken rule that came about during the 80s. That perhaps somebody could find a publication or something that really pushes for it. Some of the first photographs of why somebody started painting their orcs and goblins green for Warhammer or their miniatures for Dungeons and Dragons. But in all honesty, there's not a lot to support it until the very end of the 80s and into the 90s to really say that's why our goblins today are green. And now that it's been going on for some good 30, 40 years, it doesn't seem like it's going to change. Even with some of the cool innovations that are coming out, different media, I think a lot of different things are trying to experiment again with this idea of variations in goblins, different color skins. It seems to be very well supported because we've had pretty much everything. So when we look at our plunderlings with all sorts of bright and beautiful colors, or if we think, hey, maybe we need a purple goblin in Mythic Legions, there's absolutely a precedent for it. I'm a little worried my videos are getting longer and longer, but I'm having a good time. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into why our goblins are green. I do wish I had a better answer, but this is the best the internet's given me right now. If you have any other ideas, if you were around in the 80s and you just understood that goblins were green, please leave a comment or share your story. I'd love to really try to put a finer point on how we can identify when this transition began. But it's certainly an interesting phenomena, and I hope you enjoyed diving into this with me.